for today's webinar, and that's really great to see. And as Cashin mentioned, we will be posting a recording of this, as well as a copy of the slides up on our website, and provide links out to folks as well. Feel free to reach out to us if you have questions or comments about any of the resources we talk about here today. As Cashin mentioned, I'm the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Partnership. Prior to that, I was the CEO of the New York State Community Action Association, and over the years in a variety of capacities have worked with a number of nonprofit organizations, including community action agencies, on strategic planning processes. One of the things that we certainly want to be clear of what's up front, there's no one right way to do strategic planning. It's going to be individual to each individual organization. Every organization's board takes a look at this stuff a little bit differently. Everyone's executive director takes a different tact. So we're going to walk through some of the core basic elements of what goes into a strategic plan today. Some of them may fit in with a process you use. Others of them you may decide really don't fit with your organization. We're going to give you examples of, well, Denise, some of this is really basic. We want to take our plan to the next level. We're going to provide you with access to resources that can help you dig deeper or develop a more sophisticated or more broadly developed plan. So we hope to give you a variety of pieces that you can take back, put into use in your organization. And usually in this presentation, we do live, so we like to engage the audience in conversation, which I think certainly adds a lot to the discussion around strategic planning, because again, many of you have gone through these planning processes. There's a lot of expertise in our network. Some of you certainly facilitate strategic planning as well. And we don't pretend to have all the answers here, certainly. So as Cashin mentioned, the Q&A window or the chat window is a great place, preferably the Q&A window, to pose questions. Because we're such a large crowd today and we're in a webinar setting, we aren't able necessarily to do the unmuting of you as we would in a meeting format, but please use the Q&A window. You can also follow up with us after today's call. If something didn't quite make sense or you want to dive a little bit deeper into something, don't hesitate to call. The webinar is being done under the purview of our Risk Mitigation Center here at the Partnership, paid for through CSBG TNTA resources provided by the Office of Community Services. And through our Risk Mitigation Center, we are here to provide assistance. Now, we can't go out and do full-blown strategic planning processes at organizations as much fun as that can be from a facilitator's perspective. I do miss doing some of that work. We can help you process with your strategic planning committees, link you up with consultants perhaps that are in your communities or in your regions that can provide assistance, and certainly your state associations would also be a great leverage point for accessing a variety of strategic planning resources. So again, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A window for any information or questions that you might have. And we'll pause periodically to take some of those questions as they come in as well. So first, let's talk a bit broad terms of strategic planning. This is a great quote. Leadership is the capacity to translate vision into reality. And a lot of planning processes sometimes can get stuck at that. We start mission, right? We talk vision and we talk values. That's usually how we start off a lot of our planning activities. And that's a critical place to start. But we have to be conscious that we really need to move our plans to the next phase, about really translating what our vision is for the future to the reality of our situation. We have tightening funding streams. We have additional regulations coming down the pike. We have a lot of political things impacting our organization that shifts from day to day, it seems like. So the challenge of leadership is to take that broad vision and really drill down to some practical implementation of a strategic planning process. So what are the things we want to talk about here today? We want to talk a little bit about why we plan, why we go through this process. There are costs involved, and I know with our limited resources, we want to maximize whatever investments we make, but even to make the choice to go down a planning process, we have to figure out what are we going to get out the other side. We want to talk a little bit about the overlay of ROMA and strategic planning. I know there are different layers of understanding and use of ROMA within our network, but certainly the critical elements of the ROMA cycle, certainly strategic planning is a critical element of the cycle, but the whole process of planning, evaluation, and analysis all intersect with one another, and we'll talk a bit about that, certainly. The organizational standards are, I know, on people's radar screen, And the call to have agencies across this country do strategic plans is perhaps going to be a new element for some agencies. So we'll talk about what elements of the organizational standards overlay with the strategic planning perspective and responsibilities of both staff and board members. We'll also talk a little bit about the reauthorization bill that NCAP has put forward that's floating through the House right now. There are certain elements around strategic planning and boards that, again, as much as we can inform and make sure the network as a whole is familiar with what's in that reauthorization bill, we wanted to take a chance here today to touch on the strategic planning elements. And then we're going to walk through, again, some nuts and bolts of the activities and processes that many agencies employ successfully across the network in doing strategic planning. We're going to highlight a couple of toolkits, some that the partnership has done, also one that is upcoming from the Illinois Community Action Association that will give you a bit of a preview on that will be made available shortly, as well as some samples. There are a number of CAP agencies who make their strategic plans publicly available, and we're going to show you a few that I think would be good reading for folks, that if you're looking for, well, how do we do this in a strategic plan or a community action environment? What if I'm a public CAP? How do all of these things intersect? And we'll show you some places where you can go to see what your colleagues are doing across the country. So why do we engage in strategic planning? And we'd love to hear from you if there are things that you want to put into the chat window or the Q&A window about why you engage in strategic planning. But things that we've heard in the field, certainly, you got to know where you're going in order to get there. It's kind of like if it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job in terms of operations. If we just know we're headed somewhere, we really need to clarify where we're headed, who's doing what. In this dynamic environment, we really want to have a real target for our organizations. People will say, Denise, how long should my plan go for? In our dynamic environment, a strategic plan, certainly a vision could go 3 to 5 years, an outlet, we want to head here, a broad term vision for our organization, but real work plans and operations plans, really you're looking at a 1 to 3 year work plan, with your first 2 years really being the only sense of real practical usability probably in today's dynamic environment. Things shift so quickly, the dynamic funding environment, regulatory environment, but if we don't go down the road of planning, we'll never find, we won't have a map for us to be headed in the right direction. Some perspectives on strategic planning from our perspective here at the partnership. And again, please put things in the chat window or Q&A window if you disagree or you have a story you'd like to share that we can read off to folks, but would welcome your thoughts. From our perspective, strategic planning is an agency-wide activity. We know that sometimes you'll do individual programmatic strategic plans, whether that might be in a Head Start program or an energy services program or a family development program. And all of those planning pieces have a real value to really engage staff and really drill down to operational work plans. But when we talk strategic planning, we really are trying to frame it up as agency-wide. The board, the staff are engaged. We're setting the vision for the whole organization. We're reflecting on the mission of the entire organization. And when we talk about organizational standards, we are talking that an agency-wide strategic plan be in place for the organization. From our perspective, a strategic planning process is board-led, but staff engaged. It is a board's responsibility, one of their critical responsibilities, to set the direction of the organization. It's their job to set the target, to set the vision. So having a board-led process is critical. We'll talk about a strategic planning committee that would be set from the board, shared by a board member, but perhaps that staff engaged piece is equally as critical from my perspective. Strategic planning operationally, at the end of the day, who's putting it into play, it becomes a critical element of the executive director's evaluation. It's a key element of program directors' evaluations. And odds are in best practices that every staff member in the organization can in some way, shape, or form tie their job responsibility to that strategic planning document. So engaging staff in that process, I think, is really critical. And we'll talk about a variety of ways to do that. And again, there's no one right way to do it, but we'll give you some examples. It's critical that you use a variety of information, a lot of data points that might be collected, things that are included and collected as part of your community needs assessment process can be critical elements to feed into your process, and we'll talk a bit about that. Analysis of your prior plans, successes, misses, what did we do, what didn't we do, what were some of the roadblocks. Doing some of that environmental scan is a critical element of planning as well. As we talked a bit earlier, strategic planning is a core element of the ROMA cycle. We'll talk a bit more about that as we go forward, but just making sure that if we're thinking ROMA, certainly it's not just that MPI, it's not just strategic planning, it's not just needs assessment, it is the whole way we manage our organization. And again, there's no one right way to do strategic planning. I'm going to pause here. Cashin, have any questions or comments come through yet from the chat window or Q&A window?
Not yet.
Okay, thanks. So let's talk a bit about the importance of doing planning. Why do we plan? Certainly, strategic planning can help us anticipate and head off some challenges. Now, is it going to help us avoid them altogether? Certainly not. But if we do a good environmental scan, including a SWOT analysis, we'll talk about a SWOT analysis, where we're looking at our internal strengths and weaknesses, what do we really have going for us, and what may be more of a challenge, and then what are some of those external forces that are coming down the road at us, whether it's increasing partnerships or increasing competitors. There are oftentimes environmental factors for us to take a look at. It can help unify people and strategies. I've been in a lot of strategic planning retreats, and the energy that if you come out of that retreat, people can really be pumped up if it's been an engaging day, or 2 days, or 3 days. Planning retreats can really span a period of time. So it can really be a chance to reunify people and rally them around the mission. If you're jointly setting the vision for the long term, getting everyone's buy-in is a real critical piece, and it can really help unify board and staff toward moving down that road together. Doesn't guarantee it, but it can certainly be an element of that. Mobilizing or focusing resources. Strategic planning is often a part of making hard choices. I know if you've gone through the ROMA training, we talk a lot about, do we maintain programs just for the sake of maintaining programs, or at times do we need to stop doing certain things, either because they may not be effective, financially maybe they're not working well for our organization. And we're going to give you a tool and a resource that can help you navigate and measure your program's effectiveness both by money and mission, because both of those pieces really are critical. But as you drill down in a planning process, identifying where are you going to spend your limited resources? Are you going to ramp up some advocacy work because you want to focus more on community goals? Are you going to focus perhaps on transportation as a programmatic area? Do you need to ramp up your finance area from an agency capacity issue area? So it can really help you target some of those resources. Supporting staff decision-making and board decision-making. Whether it's deciding what financial software system to have, to the skill sets of the next deputy executive director. Strategic planning, if you're focusing on ramping up your financial management, or if you're creating a fund development plan as part of your strategic plan, it may help you decide what kind of skill sets you need, what kind of products or what kind of software systems you need to invest in as an organization. But if you're not sure where you're headed in those areas, you don't know whether or not or where to invest some of that. So it can really help support good decision-making from an organization. Can identify and support new leadership. If your organization 5 years from now, as part of your strategic plan, is to have revenue coming in from a social enterprise in your organization to be 20% of your agency's budget, you're going to need some skill sets around the table around developing a social enterprise. So if you're hiring a new ED in the next 5 years, if you know that's on your radar screen, or you're hiring a new leadership team around certain family development director, or even a Head Start director, or weatherization director, energy services director, hiring mindsets that are embracing of social enterprise or entrepreneurial activities may be critical. So it can really identify what kind of new leadership skills you need to have, If you have some emerging leaders in your organization, oftentimes the strategic planning process can be a place where that talent kind of bubbles to the top. Who are the first people who are volunteering to run that focus group with the team parents? Who's the first staff member to volunteer to run, be part of your community forum to gather qualitative information from one of your neighborhood associations? Those volunteers in your staff office can really highlight some new and up-and-coming leadership in your organization. Strengthening existing leadership. Being a leader of a CAP agency right now, executive, deputy executive, finance, Head Start director, team member, it can really be a challenge. So giving your leadership team the knowledge of where to invest, where to head, and know that the agency as a whole has agreed on a certain direction can really help strengthen existing leadership. And setting context for accountability. As I said earlier, at least the ED evaluation is most likely going to be directly tied to achieving the outcomes in your strategic plan. And certainly that's over time, not something that happens immediately. I would argue that certainly your program director level, your senior management team, is implementing the operational components of your plan. And whether or not you're achieving those milestones, certainly as staff accountability, but also for board accountability. We recommend certainly regular board assessments. And doing that board assessment regularly, holding the board accountable for progress toward achieving governance goals outlined in your strategic plan, or how well the organization as a whole is moving forward, can be a critical element of accountability. And again, generating energy and confidence. As I said, coming out of a planning retreat that goes really, really well, the energy is palpable. The opposite is also true. If you come out of a planning process that dragged on too long or didn't engage or didn't ask the right questions, it can kind of suck energy out of the room too. But good planning can really help set confidence in the board and staff leadership from other staff. If people are being thoughtful about that, hopefully your entire staff team is going to be considering, hey, this organization has a plan, they've laid out the resources, we have an operational plan that's taken us there. And this is a good place to also caution. It's easy to talk about, right? It's easy for me to say, oh, this stuff is all really great, you should be doing it. The practical reality on the other side, though, the real implementation of these processes can be incredibly challenging and difficult. So we don't want to discount the difficulty that it can be to really do this process and be focused on this process. So Cashin, I'm going to pause again. Have any other questions or comments come in through the chat window?
Yes, we do have one question for you already. It says as their organizational development team is leading an effort to develop the agency's first internally initiated strategic plan, how do they get the board to understand that this process is inherently their responsibility?
That's a great question. And I'm glad that your team is going down this road and developing your first plan. We'll talk a bit later about the organizational standards and the call to action for boards on their strategic planning role. We'll talk about the board needs to approve, and I would argue need to be engaged, although the standards talk about the board needs to make sure there's a strategic planning process happening. We'll also talk about the reauthorization bill and the role of the board to be engaged in the strategic planning process. So there are some elements coming along from that side, but just because someone tells us we have to doesn't mean boards necessarily then will engage because they want to, and that's what you really want. You really want your board to understand that setting the vision and direction is their core responsibility. Good board training should really outline the critical functions of a board, their duties and responsibilities, everything from financial oversight to evaluating and supervising certainly the executive directors, looking at fund development issues, but strategic planning and setting the vision, if you get board training, that would be hopefully one of the critical elements included in a duties and responsibilities type training. But again, training doesn't necessarily move the needle either on boards seeing it as their responsibility. What I have found to be successful is if you can find a board champion on your board, hopefully either your board president or perhaps the up-and-comers on your board, your vice president, if your current board chair is not someone who is seeing planning as a board responsibility, either working with them one-on-one to talk about the responsibilities as well as the accountability coming down the pike on standards can maybe ramp that up a little bit. But thinking about your board succession planning, who are your up-and-comers? Can you develop a champion who's done strategic planning as part of another organization? Have they been involved with it in their own private business, if they're a business person or a government person or a faith-based person? Community organization person. Planning happens at a lot of levels. So oftentimes it can be peer-to-peer motivation can be critical for moving the board needle on a lot of things. And I think that would also play here in strategic planning, getting a board champion who says this is critical. And ideally having that person be in a leadership capacity, whether that's on the executive committee in the board chair or vice chair role, would be good. We will talk about a strategic planning committee and the importance of that chair. A chair of a strategic planning committee should also be a champion. So even if that person is not in a leadership situation currently, putting them into the chair role of a strategic planning process would hopefully bring them along in that process. So it's not easy. We're certainly available to web in like this into planning committee meetings to help you strategize about that as well. But good board training should hopefully highlight it. The standards and reauthorization bill will hopefully provide some oomph behind it, but finding that champion for peer-to-peer leadership is going to be critical. Thank you for that question. I hope that that addressed some of the concerns, and please let us know if not, and please keep the questions coming. Anything else, Cashin?
We do have one more that's come in. It says, it seems that we may have done our strategic planning backwards. The agency has met and developed a strategic plan, and now the agency is doing their community needs assessment. Should we start over with the strategic planning after we have analyzed the needs assessment?
That's a great question, and that you're not atypical in that situation. Ideally, you would do your strategic plan, your needs assessment first, so you would have that information to kind of feed into your planning process. But again, it's not atypical for the planning function to kind of be heading off over here, and the needs assessment's being done over here. We talk a lot about the need to update a strategic plan. So I wouldn't start over. I think your plan is your plan. It's good to work your plan once you have your plan. But what you're going to want to do next, once you complete your community needs assessment, is to assess. Did anything bubble up in that community assessment that the planning committee might want to revisit? Is there something that has come out as a significant need in our community that we did not address? Do we need to find a way to address that in either an addendum to our plan or an update to our plan? But I would argue a good strategic planning process probably happens about every 3 years. I know the standards will say you need to do it every 5, but if you've done a plan in the last year, you're doing your needs assessment now, ideally you would revisit it, and then a year from now, perhaps maybe start a new planning process. So don't start over, but use this kind of as the new starting point, either for an update on your plan or for the fresh start for your next strategic planning cycle. Any other questions so far?
That's all we've seen so far.
Great. Thank you. Very good practical questions. I appreciate that. And hopefully your colleagues do too. If you have a question, odds are you're not the only one or have experienced some of the log jams in some of the processes. Now, strategic planning isn't a magic wand. It's not going to fix stuff if things are broken. It can help move things. It can help solidify some stuff. It can help us focus. But it can't fill a leadership void. It's not going to magically make a leader step into a certain direction. If the leader's not willing to go, if your board has decided that you're going to do, and your planning process has decided we're going to do that social enterprise development to increase our the revenue that our own agency generates on its own to free up our reliance perhaps on grants, unless someone is willing to take that ball and run with it, that's not going to magically happen. So again, it's when you drill down to the actual action plan and that accountability piece, while it can't fill a leadership void, it may help you find where some of those gaps might be. It's not going to fix bad board or staff behavior. If you have trouble making quorum for board meetings, you may right away see a bump in increased board performance if you've had a good planning process, because again, it can reinvigorate and get that energy going. But you have to find, if you're going to have a governance, and I would argue all agencies should have a governance goal in your strategic planning process, but that board behavior is an ongoing challenge to really making sure we're keeping the organization healthy. So it's not going to fix all those problems. It can help you address them and help you keep people accountable, but it's not going to magically fix some of these challenges. It's not going to make money appear. Just because you set a goal that you're going to increase your revenue by 20% isn't going to make it happen. So it's going to, but it can again help accountability, help you set up a work plan, help you set up a process. It's not going to mobilize or empower people who aren't included. I would argue that doing board and staff surveys and engaging board and staff at all levels in some way, shape, or form in the process is critical. If your frontline folks are a critical element of the implementation of your plan, you really want to find a way for them to be engaged in the process. And a survey is one way to help them do that. All staff days where you're updating or gathering their information. There are ways to engage them that can still be meaningful, but hopefully not overwhelming. You can't build on unacknowledged strength, and you can't improve unacknowledged areas of weakness. That strategic planning room where you're talking and doing your SWOT analysis requires some harsh honesty. If you have never done fund development, but you want to have a fund development plan, you're going to need to talk about the challenges and perceptions and beliefs about your board and staff, about how you feel about asking people for money, a very hard thing to do. Talking about 100% board participation and giving. Again, different organizations feel different ways about it, but if you're going to set targets and goals, you have to be honest about the good things as well as some of the challenges that organizations face. So let's be clear here of what we're talking about. I found this to be a great resource. The TCC group, based out of New York City, but I believe they're a national firm. I've been familiar with them for years. Some really great resources. They used to be called, I believe, the Conservation Company, but now they go by TCC Group. You can Google them, find some really great information. They talk here about delineating between and defining the types of planning all nonprofits, and I would argue public. I know we have public caps on the phone as well, being engaged in this process. Strategic planning provides guidance in fulfilling a mission, maximum goals and efficiency and impact. Big picture stuff, right? Goals, action steps, what kind of resources. It's big picture, 3 to 5 years, vision 5 years, strategic plan 3 years. An operating plan or an operations plan, it's a coordinated set of tasks for carrying out these goals that are delineated in the strategic plan. Really a year-to-year work plan might be a different way to frame it out. So you'll have a 3 to 5 year, 5-year vision, 3-year strategic plan, and I would argue a 2-year work plan or operations plan. A business plan may also be a product of your planning process or for part of your business strategies. These are really focused on the actions and investments necessary to generate income from a specific program or service. Nonprofits do business plans all the time, but it is not a strategic plan. But if you're developing a new business line, again, to generate revenue, a new social enterprise, a new child care center, you're doing your energy services for moderate income families as well as low-income families, developing a business plan is a separate core task from strategic planning or an operations plan. Really looking at the competitive environment, looking at your revenue assumptions, assessing your potential customer base, but a business plan is a different type of planning. And then oftentimes people do blend fund development planning with their strategic planning, and we talk about developing a mission and vision and values as part of your organization-wide strategic plan. A case statement, though, often is part of a fund development plan. It's really geared toward marketing, fundraising, really trying to encapsulate what you're looking to generate money for when you're going to donors. So again, this TCC paper is a very useful document. I would encourage you to Google that. Cashin, any questions or comments that have come in?
Yes, we do have one that says, when should you hire a consultant and when should you try to do this in-house?
Excellent question, and we'll talk a bit about that. The issue of hiring consultants or trying to do it in-house. I have been part of plans where I've been a staff member of an organization that's been facilitated by the executive director of the organization. I have been the consultant in the room facilitating it with an organization, including community action agencies. We've seen it where it's been a pro bono consultant. It doesn't always have to be a paid consultant coming in the door. I do tend to be a proponent of using a consultant, whether it's paid or pro bono or a barter. I've seen agencies where they exchange executive directors. One ED might facilitate one's retreat versus the other. But having, and certainly in that kind of scenario, staff is going to do a lot of the data collection, a lot of the legwork. It kind of depends on what your organization needs, what your resources are. There is a value to using an outside facilitator or consultant, I think, to allow everyone in the room to participate, board and staff. Consultants can do focus groups, perhaps from a more independent perspective. They can look at key informant interviews, again, from an independent perspective, but all that costs money. So a lot of agencies we see do a blend. Staff or staff leadership or even board members may run focus groups, do the key informant interviews, moderate a community forum, analyze primary data. But they may use a consultant to analyze some of that and frame it up for the board and for the staff or facilitate a retreat. Consultants are also helpful to take the first stab at writing a document. That time, adding on to an ED's already heavy workload or a program director's already heavy workload is a lot to ask. By outsourcing writing and compiling, it can be a really good function. And you can spend everywhere from $0 to $50,000 on a consultant. But the critical piece is that you know what you're buying, you know what deliverables you're asking them for, and you know what your costs are going to look like up front. Some consultants do it on an hourly basis. Some do it on a deliverable basis. And we could talk about the pros and cons of that as well. And again, happy to meet with any individual agency privately about that if you have questions with your strategic planning committee. And we'll talk a bit more about how some of that plays out. But there is certainly a benefit to using a consultant. But certainly the resource aspect can be a challenge for organizations to use too much of a consultant. But again, if you can barter, if you can find a university, sometimes they'll take it on as a class project, but sometimes you get what you pay for in those scenarios too. You have to be cautious with that as well. Any other questions at this point, Cashin?
No, I think we're ready to move into the next section here.
Great, thank you. Good questions. All right, those of you who are, again, ROMA trainers are familiar with this quote from Peter Drucker. Building around mission and long-term goals is the only way really to integrate shorter-term interests. Management can always ask, is an objective leading us toward our basic long-range goal, or is it going to sidetrack us? St. Augustine says, one prays for miracles but works for results, and your plan can lead you to work on results. It converts intentions into action. You've heard the piece, plan the plan, but you got to work the plan. I think this is Drucker's take on you got to work the plan in order to make it reality. Okay, for most of you, this should not be a surprising slide. This is the current ROMA cycle. We know we're in the midst of ROMA Next Gen in the field, but what we've been telling folks, and Barbara Mooney and our team at NASCAST, certainly when they're talking ROMA Next Gen, it's not really shifting the cycle, right? It's ramping up these core elements and doing a better or more thorough job or doing them differently. But these core elements aren't going anywhere. The ROMA's management cycle, and this is management, this isn't all about MPIs, right? We assess the needs, we plan, we work the plan, which means we implement, we document our achievement of results, and then we evaluate our results. And what happens is that analytical piece of the ROMA cycle, which is a critical element of the strategic planning process. So again, our ROMA activities really do start at the bottom of the pyramid, starting with the community assessment, but as we talked earlier, no reason to start fresh if you've done one piece before the other, but typically you do the assessment first. The planning process really is where you identify those broad range priorities for the organization, and you're looking to address needs based on your mission and vision. Now, some planning processes will go down the road of really developing outcomes and outcome indicators. I think that's very good for an organization to be able to do that, but if you've never done a planning process, you can set your agency-wide priorities first. That's your first critical element. Agencies who've gone down planning path in the past, moving to the outcomes and indicators is the next step. And more organizations are even becoming very sophisticated about really itemizing what those services and activities are going to look like, hand in hand with the financial investment that those priorities and activities will take for a full-blown strategic plan. The 6 national goals certainly play a role in community action strategic planning. Hopefully these goals aren't a surprise to folks on the phone. These are our 6 national goals. Now, I've seen some organizations, CAP agencies, who, when they develop their strategic plan, these are their agency goals. They have 6 goals for their strategic plan, and they are low-income people become more self-sufficient, the condition in which low-income people's lives are improved, et cetera, et cetera. And the plan drives from there. So they've really taken the ROMA concepts and the ROMA goals, and we start there. I've seen other organizations take the ROMA family, agency, and community. You'll see here, we have 2 family goals, 2 community goals, 2 agency goals. They design their plan around family, agency, and community. And when we talk about the organizational standards, you'll see kind of what we mean about family, agency, and community. Now, in the standards, we do say and or, so We're not saying all CAP agencies have to address family, agency, and community goals, but we do encourage you to identify that you're talking about one of those core elements. So again, there's no one right way to do it. Again, some use the 6 goals as their broad strategic goals. Some have the plan roll up. They drill it all the way down to the NPI level, or the National Performance Indicator level, right into their plan. And some of the examples we'll show you to kind of go look at on the web will show you how they do that. Some really do key into that overlay of family, agency, and community. But again, there's no one right way to do it. And the standards try not to imply that there's one right way to do it. But we do talk about in the standards the need to identify where you're talking about family, agency, and/or community. Someone earlier brought up how do we convince our boards, or how do we move the board needle on some of this? IM 82 is a document that I would argue that all boards should receive either every year or every other year. In the standards, you're going to have to hand out those bylaws every other year anyway. I would attach IM 82 to that. It's the IM information memoranda that OCS drafted to inform boards, or more expressly describe the board functions as it relates to community action. And certainly it reiterates what's in the Act around fully participating in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of the program to serve low-income families and communities. Now, that kind of language, as a governance person who does a lot of board training, we have to find a way to make sure our boards are getting into operations. And we don't want them to be in operations. We want them to be at the governance level. And strategic planning is a nice way for them to engage in developing program ideas, planning for the direction of the organization, looking at implementation history and developing an implementation plan, and evaluating the effectiveness of our program. Strategic planning is one way where boards embody IM 82 without delving into the operation side of the equation. So this can be another way to kind of move your boards a little bit forward on that. So before we move into the org standards, Cash, and I'll pause again. Have any other questions come in?
Yeah, while we're kind of on a ROMA frame of mind here, can you discuss the link between doing your theory of change and strategic planning?
The theory of change, an important piece of work that NASCASP and Barbara Mooney and the whole ROMA Next Generation team is working on currently. The theory of change is a critical element, and you're seeing a lot of funders asking, what is your theory of change? And that's one of the reasons, certainly, I mean, it's bubbling up here in the Community Action Network. I know out in Region 10, we have a couple states doing state-level theories of change, and there's going to be a toolkit coming out from the ROMA Next Gen Center of Excellence around helping agencies develop their own theories of change. So the theory of change is really an articulation of what assumptions we make about the way we do business and what the current status of our organization looks like, what's our environment look like. And then it talks about what goals you want to achieve and what strategies you're going to do to achieve those outcomes. It sounds an awful lot like a logic model. And so those of you who are doing logic models on a regular basis, the theory of change is going to look very familiar to you. But your planning process is going to, if you're going to do an agency level theory of change, your strategic plan will inform that process significantly. It will help you frame up your assumptions. It will help you frame up what goals and activities you're doing and what your key outcomes at the end of the day really look like. I think they overlay quite nicely. And if we look at a phase 2 strategic planning webinar, maybe that's something that we could do in partnership with the ROMA Next Gen folks to take that theory of change and talk about how it intersects with strategic planning. Great question. So we're really looking forward to that toolkit from Next Gen folks about how agencies can develop their own theory of change. And from my perspective, it's a nice way to frame up how we do business in community action and our unique way of doing business. And more funders are asking for exactly that kind of resource. And many more funders are also saying, do you have a strategic plan? We want a copy of that. A lot of community foundations and other foundations want to see you have a plan in place before they will consider you for a grant application. Good question. Any other questions, Cashin?
Not at this point.
Great. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about org standards and CSBG reauthorization. I know many of you are familiar with the organizational standards. They are currently in draft form. We are currently recording this in June of 2014, so some of you may be listening to this after the fact. We are awaiting a final IM from OCS on the implementation of standards. And right now, these are proposed by the Organizational Standards Center of Excellence and the CSBG Working Group. They're designed to, again, move the needle network-wide on strategic planning, because the working group really believes that strategic planning is a core element of governance and operations and the sign of a strong organization. Doesn't guarantee a strong organization, but a good, strong core element of any business is a good strategic plan. So that's kind of the framework these came out of. So let's talk here a bit about what specifically agencies would need to have in place in order to comply with the organizational standards. And we frame them up as private and as public, because there are private CAP agencies across this country, and about 20–25% of you are public CAP agencies, which means municipalities receive CSBG resources, and the CAP agency comes out of a local municipality, city government, county government. It happens in a variety of different ways across the country. But on the private side, the organization has adopted or has an agency-wide, strategic plan in place that has been approved by the governing board within the past 5 years. Same thing on the other side, on the public side, that the department, wherever CSBG is housed, has a strategic plan or a comparable planning document. Oftentimes, municipal governments will engage in a broader county-wide or city-wide planning process, and their agency's work will be embedded in that. So that would be acceptable within a public CAP environment. However, if there isn't one, the tripartite board or advisory body would need to develop one for the department or for the CSBG resources. But again, there's a 5-year window, and it's approved by the governing board at a board meeting and approved in the minutes. Number 2, the plan addresses the reduction of poverty, revitalization of low-income communities, and/or the empowerment of people with low incomes to become more self-sufficient. Again, there's and/or. You don't have to raise all three. And I have yet to see a strategic plan from a CAP agency that in some way, shape, or form does not address poverty, revitalization of communities, or empowerment. This language comes right out of the Act in terms of our purpose as an organization. So this may be reflected in the the mission of the organization. It could be reflected in the types of broad goals or strategies you set. It may be addressed in the vision of the organization. And the working group will be giving you additional guidance on some of that. But there's a lot of different ways you can address poverty, revitalization, and empowerment. Let's jump to 6.3. Here we talk about where the plan contains family, agency, and/or community goals. One of the initial drafts of the standard said you needed to address all three, because we are called under the CSBG Act and our originating mission out of OEO to have a catalytic mission, to be engaged in family, agency, and community activities. And we've heard from a lot of folks, well, we don't really do a lot of community work. We probably do more community work than we really think or know that we do or document that we do. And I know the ROMA Next Gen folks are looking at new indicators around community goals. Those are critical because we're called to have that, again, macro change at the community level. But again, here in the standards, it's and/or these issue areas. And people say, well, Denise, how do I document? Do I have to have a family, agency, community section in my plan? And I would say, no, you don't. I think however you do your plan is how you're going to do your plan. And what's meaningful to your organization is what's critical. The issue is, can I take a highlighter, for instance, and highlight the 3 or 4 areas that hit family issues? And can I take my yellow highlighter and hit the community issues? And most agencies, most strategic plans are going to have agency capacity building. Again, I have yet to see a plan that comes out that doesn't have some way, shape, or form addressing agency capacity. So I take my pink highlighter and highlight where we're addressing agency concerns. So you don't have to frame it up this way, but we should be able to find those elements in a final plan. 6.4, that customer satisfaction and customer input that is collected as part of your community assessment is included in the planning process. That would mean when you do your environmental scan or you're doing your SWOT analysis, you're looking at that information. You don't want to just collect all that information, go through all that work and have it sit on the shelf. You really want your planning committee to look at that information. If you're having a retreat, having that information available to your board, to your staff is a critical piece. But again, documenting that somewhere that assessment took place is what this standard is asking for. And 6.5, the board has received an update on meeting the goals of the plan within the past 12 months. Many organizations form an ad hoc strategic planning committee. It's alive for 6 months and then it goes off to pasture. I'm a proponent of a long-term, a permanent, in essence, it could still remain ad hoc and not be mandated in your bylaws, but an ongoing planning committee that is charged with, on an annual basis, providing an update to the board. And I would even argue that best practice is quarterly, that a quarterly update to the board on your progress makes a lot of sense. Now, some agencies will say, we haven't moved the needle. Our goals are big picture. Totally understand. But again, regular updates to the board is what's critical. And here the standards call for at least an annual update on these pieces. So, and then let me go through a few more standards and then we will pause for questions. 4.1, I highlighted here a few other standards that will play out or will touch on the other organizational standards, but touch on strategic planning. First of all, 4.1, the board has reviewed the organization's mission statement within the last 5 years. You'll see that that timeline aligns with the strategic planning window. And make sure that that mission addresses poverty and that your programs and services are currently in alignment with your mission. Nobody wants to review a mission statement for days on end. This calls for us just to reflect on our mission, make sure it's still vibrant and appropriate to our organization. Many of CAP agency missions are broad enough to encompass a lot of activities, which is critical because we do a lot of different things. But it's critical that you're making sure that it's still fresh for your organization. 4.3, that your CAP plan and your strategic plan, again, 2 different documents, document the continuous use of the full ROMA cycle or comparable system. Now, people say, why do you have that comparable system in there? That's because the Act does allow for a comparable system. And there are places around this country where the argument is being made that perhaps we use a comparable system. But the system would be, do you assess, do you plan, do you implement, do you analyze? Those pieces are really the critical elements. In addition, the organization demonstrates having used the services of a certified ROMA trainer or its equivalent to assist in implementation. This is not meant to be a burden to agencies. If you have a ROMA trainer on staff, certainly it's easier for you. If you don't, this doesn't mean you have to hire a ROMA trainer to be involved. It means at some point in time, whether it's when you're developing your CAP plan, when you're developing your strategic plan, you're touching base with someone who has some familiarity with the broad scope of ROMA. Just to talk, to consult, to call into a strategic planning committee, to meet with a staff person to make sure you're on the right track. But this is to really help agencies connect with ROMA and someone who's familiar with the ROMA training, the ROMA cycle, the ROMA process. It's not meant to be a burden, although I know I have heard from some agencies, we're not sure quite how to do this. We really want to find a way to frame this out. So we will be writing additional guidance to the network on this as well. All right, so those are the pieces that fit with organizational standards. Cashin, questions or comments that have come in?
Not at this point. Apparently, we're very clear on the standards right now.
All right. Let's see. So something that came in on my window here, let me just take a look. Maybe it just came in this direction. Or maybe not. No, that's probably just our old questions. Great. Sorry about that. Okay. Incorporating the organizational standards, if you're in the midst of a planning process right now, incorporating them I think would be you have an opportunity if you're in the midst of a strategic planning process right now to really say, okay, let's say meeting the standards is going to be a critical element of our strategic plan. Do we need to invest perhaps more on our governance strategic plan or the governance goals and the governance activities to ramp up our board training or our board structure? Do we need to consider the need to have our bylaws reviewed as part of our governance strategic plan? And oftentimes we will see that element. There are a variety of places where standards might pop up. So making sure that your board and staff are familiar with the standards I think is critical. All right, let's talk about the reauthorization bill. I'm not here to I'm not a lawyer. This is certainly NCAF. David Bradley has put this bill together quite an elegant way of framing up our network and the impact we have and how we function as a network. It has a lot of accountability measures at all levels. If you have not read the reauthorization bill, I encourage you to do so. If you can't find it, let me know. We'll send you a link to it. It's an important document for all of us to be familiar with. And we'll be looking at it and aligning it with a number of areas of the org standards as well. But please, if you have not read it, take a look at it. But in the bill, they do define strategic planning, and you can see here the term strategic planning means a plan that is adopted as a policy of the eligible entity, which means it's adopted as the policy of the CAP agency. And when you adopt as the policy, that implies the board needs to adopt it. That it establishes the goals for a period of not less than 4 years, so a bit of a tighter time frame, that are based on meeting needs identified by the entity in consultation with residents of the community through a process of the comprehensive community needs assessment. So again, tying all those pieces together in the ROMA cycle, as we talked about earlier, you can see it reflected here in the reauthorization bill as well, that goals can be driven from your needs assessment. And I should pause and say, because your needs assessment says transportation is an issue in your community, or that housing is an issue in your community, or food deserts are an issue in your community, and odds are one of those may likely fit into your needs assessment. Your strategic plan, your agency, if it's not a housing organization, isn't all of a sudden going to develop a housing program. It's not also automatically going to develop a transportation system. It's not going to open a grocery store in a low-income community. But what it would cause you to do in your strategic plan is to talk about the linkages your organization will make and has made and will continue to do so. If transportation is an issue in your needs assessment, you don't have a transportation department. Addressing the need of transportation in your plan in your program area is about providing additional linkages around transportation, around food access, around whatever those gaps in services might be, would be a way for your plan to address those needs without you, my goodness, I have to create a housing development. But I just wanted to make sure I paused there to address that piece while I thought about it, actually. All right. So B, provides detail on how all activities of an eligible entity under the subtitle, meaning CAP agencies, will contribute to meeting such goals, including but not limited to how such entities will use the funding received under the subtitle to reduce poverty through the impact of the causes of poverty in the community. Sorry, I had a few typos there. I need to clean that up. But again, provides detail on how all activities of a CAP agency will contribute to meeting those goals. So this statement is making sure that your strategic plan is very broad in scope for your organization. So keeping that in mind as well. And specifies how your activities will be managed, funded, and measured by your performance management system. And again, here calling your board to action. The duties of the board include participating in each of the comprehensive needs assessments, developing or adopting a policy of the community action strategic plan, and preparing for the use of the CAP plan for the use of the funds. So again, the Act does talk to us about our boards being engaged. All right, so let's get to some of the nuts and bolts. Keeping an eye on the clock here, we've diverted a bit, so we want to make sure we focus on some of the nuts and bolts. Are you ready to plan? One of the first elements are your board and your executive director. Are they on board with this? Do you have board commitment? This is going to take time. This is going to take resources. So engaging, making sure you have your board committed, making sure your ED is on board and not seeing this as just another thing we have to do, really seeing the value. And does your ED have the time to commit? If you're in the midst of building a new housing development and starting a social enterprise and doing 3 other things, is now the right time for your organization. Make sure it is. Do you have a strong committee chair identified? Have you identified who that person on the board who's going to lead this effort? Now, does it have to be all made up of board members? I would argue no, but it probably should be chaired by a board member, or at least co-chaired by a board member. Do you have a budget developed, both financial and human resources? Do we know what percentage of your FTEs, for instance, might be dedicated to this task as a family development director? Do you think that 10% of your time over the next 6 months is enough to be dedicated to strategic planning? Or 20% of your ED's time in a 3-month window? Whatever it's going to be, eyeball those numbers. What are your financial needs? Are you hiring a consultant or not? Do you need food for your strategic planning retreat? Are you going off-site for your planning retreat? Do you need to get space? Do you need to travel? Do you need to pay for overnight accommodations? Sometimes there are budget issues that need to be addressed. And again, organizational standards does not say, thou shalt plan now. You have to decide that this really is the right time for your organization. And with those standards being implemented over a period of time now, you have a bit of a window So I would move soon if you haven't moved, but you really need to move when the time is right for you. So, Cashin, any comments or questions right now that have come in?
No, but I would look at your microphone. For some reason, a couple of minutes ago, it's not quite as clear as it was at the beginning.
Okay, is it any better now?
A little bit, yes. Sounds good.
Okay, I might have hit a keyboard issue and moving it around here on my head. Sorry about that. I'll try to make sure we're articulating clearly. All right, let's talk planning process, or the typical process. Again, no one right way. This is just one way. A planning committee usually takes the lead planning role, usually made up of the executive director is usually engaged in that process. If not them, their designee, deputy director, but a key lead member of the management team being part of that planning committee, other board members and other key staff. And that committee would meet periodically throughout the process. That planning committee would really assess whether you need a consultant or not need a consultant, would probably make that recommendation up to the full board. It would outline your process, over whether you're taking 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. I would really like to see a planning process ideally fit within a 6 to 8 month window. It's a lot of work to do in that period of time, but you can lose energy very, very quickly if it drags on too long. The planning committee would often develop what kind of data collection tools you're using, setting the agenda for the retreat. There's oftentimes board and staff surveys. You may have a different survey for management team members that you do for frontline staff, but SurveyMonkey makes that kind of data collection very easy nowadays and very cheap from a cash outlay perspective. So we encourage surveys. Key informant interviews, conducting key informant interviews with funders, your CSBG office, foundations, media, elected officials. There are a variety of folks out there to talk to where you can collect some of that information. A retreat is oftentimes the most visible part of the process, and we'll talk a little bit about what that agenda might look like. Typically, the planning committee, I would ideally say, kind of takes the outcomes of that retreat, wordsmiths, expands upon, fleshes out outcomes and strategic areas. You don't want to spend a lot of retreat time wordsmithing anything. That's what your committee can really do. And then reports regularly on your strategic plan to the board. So we'll walk through each of these a little bit here. We talked a bit about surveys. Focus groups could also be a process piece in your interview/survey component, whether it's with groups of staff, groups of customers who come into your organization, neighborhood organizations. Surveying your board, I think, is always a critical factor. And I would also argue a board assessment can be a really important piece to do as part of a planning process. We talked about staff and frontline workers, community members. Again, setting up an online survey is cheap to do. Could you generate some community input off your website by opening up a survey? Key partners and funders can all be critical people to talk to. We talked a bit about community key informant interviews with your state CSBG office, elected officials, neighborhood groups. Again, this is where consultants can be handy. They can be charged with developing the questions, actually doing the meetings, collecting and synthesizing that information. Now, you can delegate it to staff, certainly, for cost perspective, but if you have the resources, outsourcing that can help people be a bit more honest. And again, it's that synthesizing that information to make it useful for the board and staff to consider are critical. You don't want someone's biases to say, oh, this has to bump up to the top of the list because this is my program. You really want someone who's going to independently take an eye and summarize what the key findings are out of those meetings. I think an interesting tool to use as part of a planning process is something called a matrix map. I'll show you the book title here in a moment. That was developed by a group of consultants and TA providers for nonprofits. But really critical to look at your programs by money and mission and mapping out where your programs fit along these continuums. Does your board really understand, and your staff, which programs really are high mission, high money, and which may be high mission but losing you money? I think we inherently know that. We oftentimes think we know what's going on in terms of what programs are our money winners and which ones are our money losers, which ones we really think are mission winners and which ones may not be so mission focused. But doing a formalized process can help you do that. Again, this comes from nonprofit sustainability, making strategic decisions for financial viability, written by Jean Bell, Jan Moasaka, and Steve Zimmerman. There was one book you read this year from a management perspective, I think this is a critical book to read. But it really helps you map out, and it shows you how to survey people against the mission impact, and then evaluating your business lines against the financial impact to map out your programs in each of those 4 quadrants. So you can really know what is making us money, what's losing us money. Now, that upper right-hand quadrant, right, you feed and you grow those programs. You really want to, if you're going to have a high mission program that brings you cash as well, more power to you, because you need things up in that area to help subsidize those programs on the left, where they might have a high mission but may not be costing you money. And you can have some in that quadrant. Not all of your programs have to break even or make money, but if you do have programs that lose money, you have to find money on the other side of the quadrants to help subsidize it. Now, a strategic planning process, that lower left-hand quadrant, low mission, low money, low profitability. If you find a mission that is not scoring high on mission and it's costing you resources, the board looking at, we need to perhaps stop this program. We need to move it off to a partner organization. Sometimes you'll see those programs, that's where the turf issues sit. Somebody's program who it's their baby, and that's their passionate program, can be a real political challenge to move off the dime on, but and a planning process gives you the sense and gives you the opportunity to do that. Again, here's the reference for the book, and it's low cost. You can get it relatively cheap. And as I like to say, it's got a lot of white space, a lot of pictures, and nice font. So it's not a hard read, but I would argue it's an important read. More typical things that people also see as part of the process for plans, oftentimes as part of your staff board retreat. And I would argue that it should be a board-led, key staff engaged retreat, your management team being part of those conversations and really participating in those conversations is critical. It's starting with mission, reflecting on the mission. What needs to be tweaked, if anything? Is it still relevant? Is it fitting our organization? Looking at the vision of the organization here, I pulled up Long Beach, California's vision statement. It was up on their website, and I have them as one of the strategic plans to go take a look at. So if Long Beach is on the phone today, we'd love to hear how it's really going in the field, because the document, I think, is a nice layout of a good strategic plan. But you'll see here, their vision is for their organization, right? To be the recognized leader in, I can't quite read my small font, recognized leader creating the standard for service excellence in the fight against poverty. Long Beach Community Action Partnership collaborates with a cohesive alliance of partners and stakeholders offering innovative programs and services. So it really is about the person, about the organization. Look at Heartland's vision statement. All people have enough money, meaning, friends, and to thrive. All community members thrive. Communities are fully engaged in ending poverty. A much more community-addressed vision. So again, 2 different takes. I've seen many organizations do the agency vision, and I've seen other organizations do the community vision. No one right way to do it. Some would argue, though, in community action, doing the vision for the community is critical. I would argue, though, from an organizational development capacity, you got to know where the organization is headed. So there's got to balance the 2 or do both. But you can see here a couple of different examples. Doing the SWOT analysis, internal strengths and weaknesses, external opportunities and threats. Reviewing the community assessment, reviewing that customer satisfaction, reviewing other data, analyzing previous strategic plans. But now analyzing your environment is a critical element. Oftentimes in a planning retreat, what's the next step? Where are we headed next? What I've typically done with organizations, again, no one right way, these are just some basics. Let's talk about some key strategic, typical areas where agencies need to focus. Programs, services, and activities, oftentimes it's the easiest place for us to hang our hat. What about our Head Start program? What about our Energy Services Department? What about our housing program? What about our family development program? Let's talk programs. But strategic plan isn't just about programs, right? It's about other issues. I would argue that spending some time talking about communications and marketing is critical. Talking about partnerships and collaborations. I would argue there should always be a governance goal. There's always room for the board to improve its own performance. Perhaps facilities is an issue. Facilities and grounds, buildings, maintenance, bricks and mortar. There are a lot of things perhaps their agencies may or may not need to talk about. Fund development. Many more CAP agencies are focusing some of their planning time on fund development. Historically, perhaps we have not been so engaged in fund development activities, but the stretch and pressure on our federal and state funding streams is so right now that many agencies are looking into more typical fund development strategies. sometimes competing for those limited fundraising resources in our own local communities. Spending some time talking about HR, organizational structure. Do we have the right structure for where we're headed? And IT, technology, looking at those sort of things. So oftentimes in a retreat, you would choose a number of these elements and spend some time setting some strategic direction around each of these, setting some goal statements around each of these areas. If not all of them, a subset of them. But again, the ones that are meaningful to your organization. I think in a retreat setting, fleshing out some of those broad goals and activities and objectives. Capture as much information as you can in each of those critical areas. You have the folks in the room around your retreat table, gather that information. But don't wordsmith. Delegate that out to your strategic planning committee. Charge that committee with setting up perhaps some time frames, getting to the level of detail, or being charged with delegating even further out into the organization to develop the real operational plans. And seeing what other additional data needs to be collected. And then after the retreat, the committee really should be charged with keeping the process moving. I would argue meeting regularly, defining the plan, writing it up, working with the consultant perhaps who's writing it up. There might be several drafts that go to the committee before it goes to the full board. You may send a draft to the full board who sends it back to the committee for additional work. Developing those milestones, framing up operational plans, but odds are you're not going to get to detailed operations in a planning retreat setting. You may be able to do a planning retreat and revisit the planning retreat group another time, but for many organizations, it is that planning committee that's going to take the ball and run with it, and need to because just of capacity issues. And that's where you need to decide the consultant as well. How much you can have the consultant do of that running the ball down the field. It can be helpful to move the process forward, but you really need to have staff and board engaged in that process before things move too far down that you can't turn back. The planning committee would be the one charged with submitting the plan to the board for approval and meeting regularly again to get updates to the board. Now, some challenges on board process. Clear unassigned leadership roles. If it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job. Making sure that people know what their responsibilities are. A disengaged board. You really want to make sure that the board is engaged in this process and not seeing as, oh, we have to do this, or do we have to do this kind of thing. And ideally, you'd really want the board and staff to be fully invested in that process. And I've seen agencies really do that really, really well. Decision avoidance. You can talk and talk and talk and talk about a program that might be losing you money and not be so mission focused, but until a decision is made about what to do, nothing's going to happen. So you got to make sure the team is willing to make some tough decisions. Never getting to the budget conversation is a challenge. It can be easy to lay out plans and objectives and goals, but getting to the money conversation, critical element, some of the toughest conversation to have. Those time frames keep extending, the never-ending strategic plan. Oh, we'll meet, we'll come back, we'll come back, we'll come back. You finally have to draw the line in the sand and say, okay, we're going to finalize this plan and we'll refresh it, we'll build on it, we'll do an update over the upcoming months or the upcoming year. But at some point, it needs to get done, and then you have to work the plan. And implementing your strategic plan could be a whole other webinar, certainly, and talking about the process behind that and how you do that. Some of the examples we have get into the implementation phase. So, how do you decide? When you decide now is the time, get a committee going, get a good chair established. Set that initial time frame. Is 6 months your window? Is 8 months your window? 12 months? What's your window going to be to get this plan from beginning to end? Decide that consultant question early. If you are going to use them, involve them early. Help them work with you to design the process. Start that data collection process, data gathering process. There are a lot of tools such as Dropbox and others that can allow you now to share resources and files relatively easily amongst both board and staff out in the field. Schedule that board retreat and have it really held sacred. Make sure you do it enough in advance that people know about it. Unfortunately, we were doing a planning retreat once in March, and unfortunately, we had a beautiful spring day, and all of a sudden, people had other obligations. So you really want board members to try to keep that date sacred. Staff as well, but oftentimes staff they have other issues in terms of missing something like that that they have ramifications for. Refresh everyone's memory on the previous plan. and your community assessment, and help be part of your process for making some decisions. So before we move into some sample toolkits and other examples that you may want to take a look at, Cashin, questions that came in over the last few implementation slides.
Sure. Several slides back you talked about profitability. Can you define what high profitability means for a nonprofit setting?
Good question. And rarely do we have high profitability, do we? And even using the term profit in our sector, because we're nonprofit. But that doesn't mean we can't legally make a profit. It just means where that profit needs to go. And certainly our federally funded and state funded programs, there are certain limitations on making profit off those programs. But assessing your business lines, if you look at the book by Gene Bell and others, they talk about really defining your business line. So you may have an energy services department or an energy services business line that includes weatherization for low-income families, weatherization for moderate-income families. That might be fee-for-service. You may have LIHEAP. You may have other services related to energy. Looking at that as a whole, does that business line profit enough? Do you make at the end of the day a bottom line number that the revenues are greater than the expenditures? Or do you not generate enough revenue, for instance, let's say through that moderate income family fee-for-service weatherization to subsidize some of the other work, or perhaps the administration for some of your other programs that are going on in your energy services department? That's the kind of analysis that needs to take place, and that encompasses direct costs as well as indirect costs and admin costs, all of those pieces, taking a harsh look at that. Same thing with your fund development activities. Some of you may have a golf tournament, and yes, it may drop, you may bring in $40,000 in cash, but have you done a critical analysis of the profitability of that event? Did it cost you $41,250 to actually do the event if you include staff time? Looking at that and with the harsh light of reality is critical to assess that profitability element. And all of us are going to have are doing work that probably is not fully subsidized by grants, so you have to find a way, where do you make those resources then that subsidize some of that other important work? And when you do that analysis, that matrix map, it can help. If some staff or board may not, why are we doing a golf tournament? That sucks up so much of our time. Well, that golf tournament clears us $20,000 at the end of the day that allows us to do the food distribution program over here that has no revenue stream supporting it. So it allows us to do these other vitally mission-based work but doesn't have a funding stream attached to it. Other questions?
That should get it for now.
All right, great. All right, some tools and resources to go beyond today. I was meeting with some folks from the Illinois Association earlier this week, literally, and they talked about this great toolkit that they are in the process of finalizing. So they said, yes, Denise, you can show it to them, show at least the cover page, and you'll see here the strategic planning framework that they are talking about in this toolkit. Once it's out, we'll be working with them to get this information out to the network, but it's nice to have a toolkit developed by a Community Action State Association, again, that will be getting out to the full network. So kudos to you in Illinois. We have a Balanced Scorecard Institute toolkit that we did probably about 2 years ago or so. Balanced Scorecard Institute is a very large firm nationally. They work with consultants all over the country to utilize their framework. This is a very sophisticated process and a very long process. But this toolkit is up on our website. Again, talks about looking mission, vision, values, looking at data collection, a SWOT analysis, using your needs assessment. We overlaid the ROMA principles into the toolkit. And it really talks about a comprehensive community assessment. You'll see here the Mayberry Community Action Agency strategic plan and scorecard graphic. Some of you who are maybe involved with Pathways to Excellence, you hear the word scorecard, it triggers, hey, we need to address the scorecard issue. And you'll see here the cascading nature of the BSI model, and you can find out more about that up on our website. I'll show you where to get that specific toolkit as well. Some great resources here to find if you're not familiar with Virtual CAP. Virtualcap.org has a lot of samples from community action to go see what your colleagues are doing. I run across people who aren't familiar with Virtual CAP. It has a ton of resources, as does our TNT Resource Center site, and I'll show you that as well. Heartland's Community Action, you can Google them as well, but I thought they had a nice example of family, agency, and community, as well as kind of an overview on their website. This, again, publicly information, so thank you, CAP agencies, for putting your stuff out on the web, and we hope we've given you fair reference, and hoping people will come to you looking for your information. Again, the Long Beach Community Action Partnership, I thought their layout was quite nice. It's clear, shows you each of the steps in the process. And again, we don't want to forget our ROMA folks, Planning for Results. They have a curriculum around comprehensive strategic planning, really embedding the ROMA principles. There are a number of folks across the country who can facilitate that kind of model. Barbara Mooney would be a great person probably to talk to about that particular model. CAP Riverside, one of our public CAPs. Again, you can Google their strategic plan. They have it up on their website. I do find that San Bernardino County, California, the one there in the middle, has taken the Balanced Scorecard Institute framework. If you're looking to see how that really interplays with a CAP agency, I think they have an excellent layout in terms of following how that works. And my friends up at CAPCO, Cortland County, New York, I was in their boardroom, and Linda Glenn is the executive director there, and they actually lay out their whole strategic plan in their room, family, agency, and community. You can see here how they frame up their community action strategic plan around family, agency, and community activities. So those are some really great concrete examples. Here's a picture of our website. You can go right to the National Training Center button up on our website. You can click on toolkits and/or webinars, resources. This webinar will be eventually posted there. We can access the Balanced Scorecard Toolkit amongst other toolkits as well on planning. We have a webinar with the BSI folks too to walk through the Balanced Scorecard model. So I encourage you to listen to that as well if you need additional information. The CSBG T&TA Resource Center, this was developed with our friends over at NASCAP in partnership with Office of Community Services with CSBG Resources. More toolkits, a consultant bank if you're looking for consultants in strategic planning by region. You can consult the consultant bank to do a search. You no longer have to register, but you can register and submit a TA request through this website. It comes to us as an agency. If you're a state office, it does go to NASCAP. If you have additional questions or concerns, you can use this site to reach us directly, or email me at dharlow@communityactionpartnership.com. We hope that many of you will join us in August for our convention. We do have a pre-con day on Tuesday the 19th for EDs as well as emerging leaders. And we'll have a lot of great sessions. I believe strategic planning is on our list of training topics as well. So here is my contact information. Don't hesitate to reach out. Again, I've webbed into other meetings and happy to web into your planning committees meetings as well, consult by phone. And our consultant bank has a ton of consultants out there who, not a ton, it has a number of consultants out there who can help you facilitate this process or be thinking about this process. So Cashin, other comments or questions that have come in?
Well, we've had several people that have asked either about the slides or will this be repeated and that kind of stuff. So I did want to just repeat that this was recorded. Slides will be available actually on that T&TA Resource Center site that we just saw a couple of slides ago. And Ken Ackerman, ever the resource, also wanted to mention in the book Good to Great about talking about moving from being an economic engine to a resource engine. So I think that's another great resource that to put on people's radars.
I would concur with Good to Great, and then the monograph, The Good to Great in the Social Sector, is a nice, another easy read, and a good book to keep in mind. Definitely. Do what you do well and get the right people on the bus. That applies in the business world and it applies to us certainly too here in the nonprofit world. All right, other comments or questions?
We do not, though. Of course, we do encourage you to send those after the fact if you think of them later. And I did want to let everyone know there will be an evaluation that will pop up as we close down today's webinar. So we do appreciate you taking a few moments to fill that out. Let us know how we did today. And of course, what other topics you would be interested in hearing the partnership speak on. So,
and thank you everyone for being on the call today. We had a good number be with us. This is fantastic. And we know the org standards might be driving some of this, and we'll be with you in the field at a variety of conferences over the next year as well. So don't hesitate to ask if we can provide additional insight or information at any time. Cashin, anything else that we need to touch on today?
I think that will get it. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.